The Unbreakable Bond, a chronicle of justice, betrayal, and redemption. The atmosphere within the courtroom was thick with tension, so dense it seemed to press against the skin of every person present. The heavy wooden benches creaked under the weight of anxious spectators, their collective breathing creating a soft, almost imperceptible hum that underscored the gravity of the moment. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, casting elongated shadows across the polished oak floor that seemed to stretch toward the defendant's table like grasping fingers. The air carried the faint scent of aged wood, worn leather, and the barely detectable trace of nervous perspiration that had begun to accumulate among those anticipating the verdict. In the center of this solemn space, the judge sat elevated upon his imposing bench, a figure of authority draped in black robes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His face, weathered by years of witnessing humanity's triumphs and transgressions, remained impassive as he prepared to deliver judgment. The courtroom itself, with its high ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork and walls lined with portraits of distinguished jurists from generations past, had witnessed countless trials, but few would prove as pivotal as this one. The judge's gavel came down with a resounding crack that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, shattering the fragile silence that had settled over the room. The sound seemed to reverberate not just through the physical space, but through the very soul of the man seated at the defense table. Michael Carter, a decorated law enforcement officer with 15 distinguished years of service to his community, sat restrained by cold steel handcuffs, his gaze fixed on the worn wooden surface before him. Despite his repeated declarations of innocence, each delivered with the conviction of a man who had dedicated his life to truth and justice, the jury had returned a verdict that would irrevocably alter his existence. Guilty. The weight of the sentence, though severe, wasn't what crushed Michael's spirit most profoundly. It was the knowledge that he would be forced to abandon Luke, his steadfast K-9 companion, the loyal German shepherd who had stood by his side through countless life-threatening situations. While the courtroom remained largely unaware of the depth of this bond, those who knew Michael understood that Luke was far more than a working partner. He was Michael's constant companion, his confidant during difficult times, his protector during dangerous operations, and perhaps most importantly, the one being who had never questioned his integrity, even when the entire justice system had turned against him. As Michael struggled to process the devastating reality of his situation, his thoughts drifted to the early days when he and Luke had first been paired together. He recalled the rigorous selection process at the police department's K-9 training facility, the careful matching of handler and dog, based on temperament, skills, and compatibility. Michael had been immediately drawn to the intelligent, focused German shepherd, with the distinctive white patch on his chest, a marking that would later earn him the nickname Snowflake among Michael's colleagues, though Michael himself always called him Luke. Their training had been intense, demanding, and transformative for both of them. Michael remembered the blistering summer days when they practiced scent discrimination exercises, the freezing winter nights when they conducted building searches in near-zero visibility, and the countless hours spent building trust through repetition and mutual understanding. Luke had learned to read Michael's subtle body language, to anticipate his commands before they were given, to distinguish between genuine threats and everyday occurrences. Michael, in turn, had learned to interpret Luke's various barks, whines, and body postures to understand when his partner was alert, stressed, or simply tired. Over the years, their bond had deepened beyond the professional into something profoundly personal. Luke had been present during the darkest moments of Michael's life. The sudden passing of his father, the painful dissolution of his marriage, the nights when the weight of the job threatened to overwhelm him. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense Michael's emotional state, often nudging his hand with his wet nose or resting his head on Michael's knee until the tension eased from his handler's shoulders. Now, as Michael faced what he believed to be the lowest point of his life, the thought of never again feeling Luke's reassuring presence beside him was almost more than he could bear. The separation would be a betrayal of everything they had built together, a violation of the unspoken promise Michael had made to protect and care for his partner. As the judge prepared to adjourn the proceedings and Michael was about to be led away to begin serving his unjust sentence, a sudden surge of emotion overwhelmed him. Without conscious thought, his voice broke through the tense silence that had settled over the courtroom, like a heavy fog. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, the words emerging hoarsely from a throat constricted by grief. "Before I'm taken away, I have one last request. Please, allow me the opportunity to say goodbye to Luke." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom, like wind stirring the surface of a still pond. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, whispers exchanged among spectators who had no idea of the profound connection between the accused officer and his canine partner. The judge paused, his expression unreadable as he studied Michael for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a slow nod that conveyed both sympathy and understanding, he spoke, his voice firm yet unexpectedly gentle. 3 minutes, he decreed. That is all I can grant. As soon as the handler released Luke's leash, the German shepherd sprang forward with remarkable speed, his claws clicking rhythmically against the polished wooden floor, like a metronome marking the passage of precious seconds. Michael immediately dropped to his knees, his restraints momentarily forgotten as he pulled Luke into a tight embrace that conveyed everything words could not. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Michael whispered, tears streaming down his face, his voice barely audible above the dog's soft whimpers. "I let you down. I won't be there anymore to protect you, to care for you. I've failed you in the worst possible way." Luke responded with a series of soft whines, nuzzling deeper into Michael's chest, his warm breath creating small damp patches on the coarse fabric of Michael's prison jumpsuit. The dog's body language conveyed a mixture of confusion and deep concern, as if he could sense the finality of this moment, the impending separation that would disrupt the carefully constructed routine of their shared existence. Then, without warning, something extraordinary happened. Luke's entire body tensed, his muscles coiling like springs beneath his short fur. His powerful nose began working frantically against the fabric of Michael's jacket, sniffing with intense focus that seemed almost unnatural. Suddenly, he tugged at the material with his teeth, emitting a series of sharp, insistent barks that cut through the solemn stillness of the courtroom like shards of glass. The unexpected behavior drew every eye in the room, transforming the space from a venue of judicial proceedings into a theater of collective curiosity. "What on earth is that dog doing?" the judge inquired, his brow furrowed with concern and confusion. Luke continued his unusual behavior, pulling harder at Michael's jacket, his barks growing more urgent with each passing second. One of the bailiffs stepped forward cautiously, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his sidearm as he began to check Michael's clothing for anything that might explain Luke's agitation. The tension in the room became almost suffocating, thick enough to choke on, as everyone held their breath in anticipation. Then, with a distinct metallic clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent courtroom, a small object fell to the floor. It was a digital recording device, its sleek black casing glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights that illuminated the space. The prosecutor's face immediately went pale, his carefully constructed composure crumbling like a sandcastle before the tide. He stepped forward quickly, his voice shaky but attempting to regain control of the situation. "This doesn't prove anything," he snapped, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his growing panic. "This is irrelevant evidence that has no bearing on the case." But Luke refused to be silenced, barking again with such conviction and urgency that his alert stance seemed to demand that someone pay attention to the significance of what had just been discovered. The truth was unmistakable. Whatever was contained on that small device mattered, and mattered greatly. Michael stared at the recorder, his heart pounding with a rhythm that seemed to echo through his entire body. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope ignited within him, fragile but unmistakable. Could this be the proof he had been desperately searching for? Did this tiny technological marvel contain the evidence that would finally clear his name and expose the conspiracy that had destroyed his life? As the courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence, the small recording device lay in the center of the floor like a modern-day Pandora's box, its metallic casing glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights that illuminated the space. The air in the room had become thick with anticipation, each person present holding their breath as if afraid that even the slightest exhale might disturb the delicate balance of this extraordinary moment. Sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to focus its rays on the device, as though nature itself recognized the significance of this discovery. The judge, his expression now one of intense concentration, broke the silence with a voice that carried both authority and curiosity. "Pick it up," he ordered, his tone low but commanding enough to snap the nearest officer from his stunned immobility. The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between the judge, the prosecutor, and the defense attorney, as if seeking permission to touch what had suddenly become the most important object in the room. Finally, with movements that seemed almost reverent, he bent down and carefully scooped the device into his gloved hand, holding it up as if presenting a sacred relic. "What is this?" the judge demanded, his eyebrows knitting together in a stern expression that conveyed both confusion and growing concern. He directed his question toward the prosecutor, whose face had transformed into a mask of pale anxiety. The prosecutor cleared his throat, visibly struggling to maintain his professional composure. "Your Honor," he began, his voice noticeably unsteady, This is irrelevant. It's not part of the evidence submitted during the trial. Clearly it's been tampered with." "Tampered with?" the judge interrupted, his voice carrying a razor-sharp edge that cut through the prosecutor's attempted explanation. "In a courtroom during sentencing?" The judge's tone was now unmistakably accusatory, and the prosecutor visibly flinched as if struck by an invisible force. "Officer," the judge continued, his gaze shifting to the man holding the device. "Activate the device." The officer fumbled with the small recorder, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the play button. A burst of static filled the room, followed by muffled voices that caused everyone to lean forward instinctively, straining to catch every syllable. Then, the words that followed hit the courtroom like a bombshell, shattering the carefully constructed narrative that had led to Michael's conviction. "Just plant the evidence," a gruff voice declared with chilling casualness. "It's as clear as day. No one's going to question it. Carter's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat. Get it done." Gasps erupted across the room like a sudden summer storm, and Michael's heart stopped for a terrifying moment before beginning to pound furiously against his ribcage. He knew that voice instantly. It belonged to Captain Ray Harding, his former supervisor, the man who had mentored him through the early years of his career, the person Michael had trusted implicitly for over a decade. "That's enough," the prosecutor blurted out, rushing toward the officer who still held the recorder. But before he could reach it, the judge slammed his gavel down with such force that the sound reverberated through the entire building. "Sit down," he barked, his tone so commanding that the prosecutor froze mid-step, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. The damning recording revealed everything: the conspiracy, the deliberate framing, the calculated betrayal by someone he had considered a friend and mentor. Luke, still sitting calmly at Michael's side as if understanding the significance of his discovery, let out a single low growl that seemed to echo his partner's silent fury. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening with each passing second. "This trial," he declared firmly, addressing the room with the weight of centuries of jurisprudence behind his words, "is not over. BFFs escort the defendant back to holding. Officers, secure that device as new evidence. We're reopening this case." For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a spark of genuine hope ignite within him as he was led away. As he passed through the courtroom doors, he turned for one last look at Luke, whose intelligent eyes were filled with unwavering loyalty. In that silent exchange, Michael made a promise, not just to himself, but to his faithful companion, that he would not allow this injustice to stand. Back in the cold, sterile confines of the holding cell, Michael sat on the hard metal bench, staring at the blank concrete wall that offered no solace or distraction. His mind raced with everything that had just transpired: the shocking discovery, the revelation of Captain Harding's betrayal, the unexpected intervention of his loyal K-9 partner. Luke's sharp instincts had uncovered what no human investigator had been able to find: concrete proof of a setup, a lifeline thrown to him at the very moment he had begun to lose all hope. But this revelation wasn't merely a relief, it was a profound betrayal. Captain Ray Harding, the man who had mentored Michael through the academy, who had stood beside him during his promotion ceremonies, who had been his sounding board during difficult cases, was behind the entire conspiracy. The realization settled heavily on Michael's shoulders, making it difficult to breathe. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, his jaw tightening as he processed the magnitude of the deception. How deep did this go? Was Harding acting alone, or was he part of a larger network of corruption within the department? The questions multiplied in Michael's mind, each more disturbing than the last. If a man of Harding's standing and reputation could orchestrate such an elaborate frame-up, what other injustices might be hidden beneath the surface of the department he had served so faithfully? Meanwhile, in the judge's private chambers, tension ran higher than the ornate ceiling of the courtroom. The judge sat at his massive mahogany desk, the wood polished to a mirror-like sheen that reflected the serious expression on his face. He had the recording device connected to a secure system, replaying the damning conversation on a loop, each repetition confirming what his instincts had already told him, that a grave injustice had been perpetrated within his courtroom. The voices on the recording were unmistakable. Captain Harding's commanding tone, paired with another voice Michael didn't recognize, revealed a calculated conspiracy that went far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity or procedural error. The judge's eyes narrowed as he listened, his experienced mind cataloging every nuance, every hesitation, every telltale sign of premeditation. He pressed a button on his intercom with deliberate precision. "Summon Captain Harding to my office immediately," he said curtly, his voice carrying the weight of authority that brooked no delay. Outside the courtroom, Captain Harding had been waiting anxiously, attempting to maintain his usual air of confidence while ensuring that Michael's sentencing had gone smoothly, at least according to his carefully laid plans. But when the bailiff approached him with the judge's sudden summons, a flicker of unease crossed his carefully composed features. He rose stiffly, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled, almost imperceptibly, and followed the officer down the hallway that led to the judge's chambers. Inside the private office, the judge's expression remained unreadable as Harding entered. The captain offered a polite nod, though his shoulders were noticeably tense. "You called for me, Your Honor?" Harding inquired, his voice steady despite the growing anxiety in his chest. "I did," the judge replied, leaning forward in his leather chair. He tapped the recorder with his index finger, the gesture deceptively casual. "Care to explain this?" Harding's facade of confidence faltered for a split second, just long enough for the judge to notice. But he quickly masked his momentary panic with an expression of polite confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor," he said evenly, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the recording device on the desk. Without further preamble, the judge pressed play once again. The damning words filled the room, echoing off the bookshelves filled with legal tomes and the framed certificates of judicial achievement. Harding's face drained of color, but he recovered quickly, forcing a chuckle that sounded more like a nervous cough. "Your Honor, this is absurd. That could be anyone. You can't seriously think—" "I don't think," the judge interrupted, his voice hardening like cooling steel. "I act on evidence, and this," he gestured to the recorder, "is evidence of a crime. Multiple crimes, in fact." Before Harding could formulate another denial, two bailiffs entered the room, their presence unmistakable and authoritative. Panic flashed in Harding's eyes as they approached him, their footsteps creating a rhythmic echo that seemed to signal the end of his carefully constructed deception. "What are you doing?" Harding demanded, his voice rising with each word. "You can't—" "You're being detained for questioning," the judge said firmly. "Until we get to the bottom of this, you're a suspect in obstruction of justice and falsifying evidence." As the bailiffs led a protesting Harding away, the judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The web of corruption was unraveling faster than he had anticipated, and Michael Carter's story was far from over. The discovery of the recording had thrown the entire police department into turmoil. As Captain Harding was taken into custody, whispers of corruption spread like wildfire among the officers, moving from desk to desk, locker to locker, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that permeated every corner of the precinct. Meanwhile, Michael sat in his holding cell, unaware of the storm brewing outside, his thoughts lingering on Luke. The loyal K9 had been the one to uncover the device, and now Michael couldn't help but wonder what else his partner might be able to expose. Could Luke's extraordinary sense of smell detect other hidden evidence? Had Michael unknowingly carried other traces of the conspiracy on his person during those final days before his arrest? At the department's K9 unit, Luke was being evaluated by Officer Sarah Mitchell, one of Michael's closest colleagues who had volunteered to look after the dog until the case was resolved. Luke seemed restless, pacing in his kennel with an intensity that went beyond his usual behavior, occasionally letting out sharp barks that echoed through the otherwise quiet building. "He knows something's wrong," Sarah muttered, watching him from outside the kennel. She crouched down, bringing herself to Luke's eye level, looking directly into his intelligent brown eyes. "Don't worry, buddy," she said softly. "We'll figure this out." As Sarah stood up, her gaze shifted to Luke's nose, which was pressed against the gate, sniffing intently at her jacket. A sudden thought struck her. Was this behavior connected to Michael's case, or was she merely imagining connections where none existed? After a moment's hesitation, she opened the kennel door. "All right, boy," she said, grabbing Luke's leash. "Let's see if you're trying to tell us something." Sarah brought Luke to Michael's locker in the department storage room. The dog immediately began sniffing and pawing at the lower compartment with an intensity that sent a thrill of anticipation through Sarah's body. Her heart raced as she unlocked the compartment and opened the door. Inside, beneath a few folded uniforms, was a small, unmarked envelope. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and opened it. Inside were photographs, grainy but undeniably damning, that showed a man unmistakably Captain Harding, meeting with a known criminal. Tucked behind the photos was a document outlining transactions that implicated Harding in a bribery scheme directly tied to the very case that had led to Michael's arrest. Sarah stared at the evidence, her chest tightening with the weight of what she had just uncovered. "Luke," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You just found the smoking gun." Realizing the magnitude of what she held, Sarah immediately contacted the judge's office. The photographs and documents, combined with the recording Luke had uncovered, painted a clear picture of Harding's guilt. But as Sarah studied the evidence more closely, she began to suspect that this was merely the tip of the iceberg. If Harding had orchestrated this elaborate setup, he likely hadn't acted alone. Sarah sat in the evidence room, the incriminating photographs spread out on the desk before her, each one revealing another layer of the conspiracy. The weight of what she had uncovered pressed heavily on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Captain Harding wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was part of something much larger. The documents Luke had helped uncover outlined connections to other high-ranking officials, payments that couldn't be explained by legitimate means, and a disturbing trail of manipulation that reached far beyond Michael's case. She glanced down at Luke, who sat alert beside her, his piercing eyes seeming to sense her unease. "This isn't just about Michael," she muttered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. "This goes way deeper." Realizing the severity of the situation, Sarah called the judge directly. Within an hour, the evidence she had uncovered was in his hands. The judge's face darkened as he reviewed the documents and photographs. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. "If these documents are accurate, Michael Carter isn't just innocent. He's a victim of a department-wide cover-up." The judge immediately ordered an emergency hearing. News of the case reopening sent shockwaves through the precinct, creating ripples that disturbed the carefully maintained surface of the department. Officers whispered in hallways, their usual camaraderie replaced by suspicion as tensions rose. Several officers who had testified against Michael began to squirm, their nervous glances and hurried conversations suggesting that they knew their involvement might soon come under scrutiny. Back in his cell, Michael was called out unexpectedly. The sudden commotion in the jail's holding area made his pulse quicken, with a mixture of hope and fear. He was escorted to a secure room where Sarah was waiting with the judge. As soon as Michael saw the folder of evidence and Luke sitting proudly by Sarah's side, his heart swelled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "This just came in," the judge said, sliding the documents toward Michael. "It proves Harding's corruption, and most importantly, that the evidence used to convict you was fabricated." Michael's hands trembled as he flipped through the papers. The photographs, the financial records, and even detailed notes outlining how Harding had manipulated the case against him. It was all there, documented in black and white. His voice cracked as he asked, "Does this mean—" The judge nodded firmly. "It means you're going free. But this isn't over yet. There are more people involved, and we're going to need your help to expose them." Michael knelt down, pulling Luke into another embrace. "You saved me, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me again." As Luke wagged his tail with unbridled joy, the relief in the room was palpable. But Michael knew this was just the beginning. Whoever had orchestrated this conspiracy went deeper than Harding alone. There were more layers to uncover, more betrayals to expose, and Michael wouldn't rest until the entire truth was brought to light. Michael stepped out of the courthouse for the first time as a free man, but the weight of what lay ahead felt far heavier than the shackles he had just shed. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions about his release, the reopened case, and the corruption scandal brewing within the department. Michael ignored them, his focus solely on Luke, who trotted faithfully at his side. The sight of his loyal K-9 partner brought a flicker of hope amid the chaos, a reminder that not all bonds could be broken by betrayal. Inside the courthouse, the judge had convened a special task force to investigate the growing web of corruption. Sarah, now an integral part of the team, was leading the charge with the determination of someone who had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of institutional betrayal. The photographs, recordings, and financial records that Luke had helped uncover pointed to a sprawling network of bribery and evidence tampering involving multiple officers and even external players. Captain Harding was just the tip of the iceberg. "Michael," Sarah said, catching up to him outside the courthouse. "We need your help. No one knows this department better than you." Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening as he processed the request. He had spent his entire career trusting the badge, believing in the integrity of the system. Now that trust had been shattered, leaving behind only jagged fragments that cut whenever he tried to pick them up. But as he looked down at Luke, the dog's calm, determined eyes reminded him of why he had joined the force in the first place. To protect and serve, to uphold justice even when it was difficult. "I'm in," he finally said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "But I'm not doing this for the department. I'm doing it for the truth and for every officer who's still fighting for what's right." The investigation began in earnest. Sarah and Michael worked tirelessly, piecing together timelines, cross-referencing cases, and interviewing officers who had worked closely with Harding. Some were willing to cooperate, their consciences apparently heavy with the weight of what they had participated in. Others stonewalled, their silence raising even more suspicions about their involvement. Luke played a surprising role in the investigation, his extraordinary sense of smell leading them to hidden files and overlooked evidence during searches of Harding's office and locker. One night, while sifting through a pile of old case files in the dimly lit evidence room, Sarah discovered a list of names, officers, local politicians, and known criminals, all linked to suspicious payments and unsolved crimes. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the trail became. It was clear that this wasn't just about Michael's case. It was about an entire network of people who had used their power to cover up crimes and destroy anyone who stood in their way. The corruption reached into every corner of the department, infecting the very foundation upon which the community's safety was supposed to rest. "Michael," Sarah said one evening, her voice heavy with concern as she looked up from the files spread across the conference table. "If we push this any further, we're going to make enemies. Dangerous ones." Michael looked up from the file he had been studying, his expression grim but resolute. "We've already made them," he said quietly. "But I'm not stopping, not until the whole truth comes out." Luke let out a soft bark as if in agreement, and Michael reached down to scratch the dog behind the ears, his resolve hardening. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced, betrayed, or framed by this insidious network of corruption. The task force worked around the clock, the small conference room that had become their headquarters filling with boxes of evidence that threatened to overflow onto the floor. Michael, now officially cleared of all charges, had thrown himself into the work with a determination born of personal experience. The deeper they dug, the more twisted the web of corruption became. Bank statements showing unexplained deposits, falsified police reports, intercepted communications, all pointing to a massive conspiracy that extended far beyond Captain Harding. Sarah placed a thick folder in front of Michael, her expression grim. "We've identified at least 6 other officers who were in on this," she said. "Some of them are high-ranking, and it gets worse. There's evidence tying them to organized crime." Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with the implications. These weren't just rogue officers breaking the rules for personal gain. This was an orchestrated operation blending corruption within the department with criminal enterprises outside of it. If this conspiracy was as big as it looked, they couldn't handle it alone. "If this is as big as it looks," Michael said slowly, "we can't handle this alone. We need to take this federal." But Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. We're still missing key pieces. If we take this to the FBI now and they leak it, the whole operation could scatter. We need something definitive. Something that locks these people in place." Their conversation was interrupted by Luke, who suddenly stood up from where he had been lying by Michael's feet. The dog's ears perked forward as he trotted toward the door, sniffing the air with intense focus. Michael frowned. "What is it, boy?" he asked, following Luke. Luke led Michael to the far side of the conference room, where a stack of old case files sat in disarray. Sarah followed, watching as Luke began to paw at one particular box with unusual urgency. Michael opened it, his heart pounding with anticipation. Inside were files from a case closed 5 years ago, a drug bust that had supposedly resulted in a clean sweep of arrests. But as Michael flipped through the documents, he noticed glaring inconsistencies. Names had been erased, and some sections of the reports were blacked out in ways that didn't match standard redaction procedures. "This doesn't make sense," Michael muttered. "These aren't standard redactions. Someone doctored these files." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, pointing to a handwritten note at the bottom of one report. "And look at this," she said. "It's a signature, Captain Harding's." The drug bust had been the perfect cover, but the evidence in the box suggested that the operation had been a smokescreen to eliminate rivals in the drug trade while shielding certain criminals who were paying off the department. Michael clenched his fists, anger lacing his voice. "They were playing both sides," he said, "and they ruined good officers' lives to do it." As they continued sifting through the files, Michael's phone buzzed with a text from an anonymous number. "You're digging too deep. Stop, or you'll regret it." He stared at the screen for a long moment before showing it to Sarah. She looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "They're scared," she said. "That means we're getting close." Michael glanced at Luke, who sat calmly by his side as if ready for whatever came next. "Let them come," he said. "We're not stopping now." Michael stared at the text on his phone. "You're digging too deep. Stop, or you'll regret it." The message sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the evidence room. This wasn't just a vague warning, it was a direct threat, specific and menacing. He showed it to Sarah, who leaned over the desk, her expression growing increasingly grim as she read the words. "This isn't random," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. "They know exactly what we're working on. They've been watching us." Her words hung heavy in the air, the weight of their situation settling over them like a suffocating blanket. As the rest of the team left for the night, Michael and Sarah stayed behind, determined to uncover the missing piece of the puzzle that would bring the entire conspiracy crashing down. Luke lay by Michael's feet, his ear occasionally twitching as he rested, the picture of calm amidst the growing tension. We're close, Sarah said, sifting through the files with meticulous care. But we're still missing the key. She pointed to a document Michael hadn't noticed before, a financial record with a series of coded transactions. Look at this. Every major bribe and erased report ties back to one name. AR. Michael's eyes narrowed as he stared at the initials. AR, he muttered. They've stayed hidden this long, but if we find them, this whole operation crumbles. Suddenly, Luke stood up, his body tense, his ears flicking forward as he let out a low, warning growl. Michael looked down at him, immediately alarmed. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. Before Sarah could answer, the lights in the conference room flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Sarah froze, her hand reaching for her weapon with practiced precision. "That's not a power outage," she said, her voice low and steady. "They've cut the main line." The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence, followed by the unmistakable thud of footsteps outside the door. Michael's heart raced as adrenaline surged through his veins. He motioned for Sarah to take cover behind the heavy conference table. "We're not alone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Luke crouched low, his growl deepening as his sharp eyes fixed on the doorway. Whoever had sent the text wasn't bluffing. They had come to stop the investigation by any means necessary. The footsteps grew louder, inching closer with each passing second. Michael gripped his weapon tightly, his mind racing through the possibilities. "Stay close, Luke," he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. Sarah locked eyes with him, her expression resolute. "Whatever happens," she said, "we don't let them win." As the door creaked open, Luke leapt forward with incredible speed, his instincts sharp and ready. Michael steadied his aim, prepared for whatever was about to come through that door. They were under attack, and the fight to expose the truth had just turned deadly. The door burst open and chaos erupted. In an instant, a shadowed figure stepped into the room, weapon drawn. Before the intruder could react, Luke lunged with incredible speed, clamping his jaws onto the man's arm. The intruder let out a guttural scream, dropping his weapon as he tried to shake the dog off. Michael didn't hesitate. He swept the gun away with his foot and trained his own weapon on the second figure now rushing through the doorway. "Don't move!" Michael shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The second intruder froze, hands raised, but the tension in their stance told Michael they were waiting for an opportunity to strike. Behind him, Sarah had taken cover and was calling for backup on her radio, her voice steady but urgent. Luke held firm on the first man, growling low as the intruder continued to struggle. "Call him off!" the man yelled in panic. Michael stepped forward, his gun steady. "Call them off first!" he shot back, motioning toward the others outside. He could hear more footsteps echoing in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Whoever these people were, they hadn't come to negotiate. The man didn't respond, but before Michael could press further, another deafening sound filled the air. Tear gas canisters being thrown into the room. Thick, acrid smoke began to fill the space, stinging their eyes and throats. "We're out of time," Sarah yelled, grabbing the files they'd been working on. "We need to move." Michael whistled sharply, and Luke immediately released his grip on the man's arm, retreating back to Michael's side. The team moved quickly, ducking low to avoid the worst of the gas as they pushed toward the emergency exit at the back of the room. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets pinging off walls and furniture. Michael could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he covered Sarah and Luke, firing back to slow their pursuers. Bursting through the exit, they found themselves in the dark alley behind the building. Sarah clutched the files to her chest, gasping for air. "We can't go back to the precinct," she said between breaths. "They've compromised everything. They'll be waiting for us." Michael nodded, his mind racing. Whoever AR was, they were playing for keeps. But as he looked down at Luke, who stood at his side panting but unshaken, Michael felt a surge of resolve. "Then we finish this on our terms," he said. "We're not running anymore." The safe house was eerily quiet, a small cabin hidden deep in the woods that served as their last refuge. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Spread across the table in front of them were the files Sarah had managed to save. Everything they needed to expose the network. Transaction records, names, and ties to AR, the shadowy figure who had orchestrated everything. Sarah flipped through the files, her fingers trembling slightly. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with both hope and dread. "If we can get this to the press or federal investigators, they won't be able to cover it up. The entire operation will crumble." Michael nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. He knew it wasn't over. Whoever had attacked them wouldn't stop until they were silenced. Suddenly, Luke's ears perked, and he let out a low growl, his body tensing with alertness. Michael froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "They found us," he whispered, the words barely audible. Sarah looked up, her face pale but determined. "How?" "We've been careful." Michael shook his head. "It doesn't matter, they're here." The first shot shattered the stillness, breaking through the cabin's window. Glass sprayed across the room as Michael shoved Sarah behind the table for cover. Luke barked furiously, standing his ground at Michael's side. More shots followed as the attackers closed in. Michael took a deep breath, adrenaline flooding his veins. "Stay down," he told Sarah. "Luke and I will hold them off." He and Luke moved in perfect sync as the attackers breached the front door. Michael fired, taking out one of the intruders. Luke lunged at another, his powerful jaws bringing the man to the ground. But the attackers kept coming. Sarah crawled toward the files, grabbing the most important documents and stuffing them into a bag. "Michael!" she shouted over the gunfire. "We need to get these out of here now." Michael nodded, his face grim. "Go! Luke and I will cover you." Sarah hesitated for a split second before slipping out the back door, disappearing into the darkness with the evidence in hand. Michael and Luke held their ground, pushing back the attackers with every ounce of strength they had. Just as the last intruder fell, sirens echoed in the distance. Backup had finally arrived. Days later, the story broke nationwide. Sarah had delivered the files to a trusted journalist, and the resulting exposé brought the entire network crashing down. Arrests were made at every level, from corrupt officers to AR himself, revealed to be a powerful local politician who had been using the police department as his personal enforcers. Michael was hailed as a hero, though he brushed off the attention. Standing on the porch of his home, he watched Luke play in the yard. The loyal dog had saved him more times than he could count, and their bond had grown unbreakable. "We did it, boy," Michael said softly, kneeling to scratch behind Luke's ears. "It's over." Luke wagged his tail, leaning into Michael's touch, his sharp eyes calm for the first time in weeks. For Michael, it wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the start of something new. He'd fought for justice not just for himself, but for the people who'd been silenced and betrayed. And as he watched Luke chase after a ball in the golden light of the setting sun, he knew they'd earned this moment of peace.